Shirley Adams for the Sewing Connection, Series 17, Program 6. When I'm an old woman, I shall wear purple, so the poem goes. Purple's one of my favorite colors. I started wearing it when I was very young, and therefore won't ever have to admit to growing old. Plan ahead. Sewing always needs prior planning to make everything gel. Sometimes you can anticipate what problems you'll encounter and weigh the alternatives. Other times you don't know there is a problem until you're in the midst of it. But the beauty of sewing is that there are always many solutions. Let's consider, for example, sleeves on closely woven fabrics. Now, these aren't exactly woven fabrics, but it presents the same problems. What I'm going to be talking about mainly is man-made leathers. And what I'm wearing here, this dress that's under my leather vest, this is also a very closely woven one. It's a microfiber, and it presents many of the same problems in that when you do the sleeve cap, you just can't ease it in very nicely. And so this is a problem. We don't want it to look homemade by having it all puckery, and so we have to weigh the alternatives and see what else we can do. Now, usually what used to be done a few years ago, here's a suede jacket, and it would have the same problems as the leathers. And what used to be done is that we'd trim a little bit of the cap of the sleeve off. And that way it wouldn't be as large. It wouldn't measure as large around the cap, and we could ease it into the armscye all right. Now, the maximum amount you can ease from notch around to notch and back is about 10 inches you have to ease in 1 inch. And you just can't get it in there. They're usually about 1.5 inches or maybe even a little more extra fabric, extra ease in the sleeve cap, bigger than the armscye into which you're going to set it, and you can't get it in any of these fabrics. So you have to decide on something else. Now, what's wrong with trimming off the sleeve cap in order to make it smaller and to get rid of some of that is the fact that, see how there are kind of folds, diagonal folds in this sleeve? I'd have to stand with my arms out, kind of like this, in order to have no folds in that because the top is trimmed off. It would be nice to have it all go straight when your arm is down closer to your body. So this is the reason why we want to do something else. There are alternatives, and that's always good. Now, I'll show you just quickly what happens when we try to ease it in. What I want to show you first, though, is a jacket that I saw in a catalog, and I thought, isn't that pretty? I'd really like to have that. Well, the wonderful part about sewing is you can have anything you want because you're capable of sewing it. I had a pattern that wasn't too far different than that. All I really had to do is add the belt to it, and other than that it was pretty much the same. But what I've done on this partially made jacket is I've put in one sleeve, I'm going to put in the other, and I have some other things done that I'll talk about before we leave this program. But what the problem is too much sleeve, too little armscye. You could, of course, make it fit by cutting the armhole, the armscye, down lower, but what happens if you do that, it's like having a straight jacket. If it's stitched down here lower, you can't raise your arm. It won't move at all. That's why it must be up higher so that you can move freely. And so what we always do, of course, is just do a big stitch there, a big basting stitch, and then we can pull that stitch, that thread, and ease it in somewhat. Maybe not. So I'm just going to ease this in to show you what it's going to look like if I actually would put it in with this. Now, if I would be doing this in some of the wool tweeds that I work with, I could put a whole lot of it in here and you wouldn't even be able to see that. It would just disappear. But not with this. See how it looks all puckery and see how it's all wavy on the edge? We don't even have to worry about that edge because that's going to be stitched inside. What we do have to worry about is anything this side of the stitching line, the sleeve side of it, and that's where we're going to see a lot of puckers. And so we need to find an alternative. If I would actually set this in the sleeve, and I don't think I'll do it because it would take too long to do, but it would actually end up looking about like this. It would really look bad. So we're going to have to get rid of about 1 inch or a little bit more than 1 inch even. So here are some alternatives. One of the things we could do, instead of putting all those gathers in, one of the things that we could do is just to, what I usually do when I'm pinning this in, I'll pin a little bit, I'll start pinning it to show you. I get those underarm points just exactly in the right place, and here on the side seam I have a seam, or right on the side of the jacket there's a seam. That's the underarm point. Here on the sleeve it comes out in a different place. it's right here where I have a little clip. And so this is what's going to match up with the underarm seam in the jacket. Anytime you put a sleeve in, you always have the sleeve right side out and you have the jacket inside out. And as I start pinning them together, I always start down at the bottom, and I'm going to pin around to about where the notch is. And actually I leave these pins in until I start sewing, and then as I come to them, I just pull them out as I need to. And I always pin this in so that the pins are parallel to the stitching line, because if you do it this way, after you get the pins in, you can actually try it on to see if it looks just right before you do any stitching. So it's a little bit quicker and easier than basting, and you get a really accurate look at it. So here I am around to where the notch is, and I would do the same on the other side. And then from that notch up to the cap of the sleeve, which is right here, and that's going to match up right here with the shoulder seam. And I have all this extra fabric to get in, and it's not going to happen. There's just too much here, and I won't be able to do it. So here are a couple of alternatives. One thing I could do is just go ahead and do all the pinning. I'll just put a pin in here at the top. Do all the pinning that I can where there isn't a problem, like under the arm and also right across the top, because this is always straight grain of fabric right across the top, so you never ease that in anyway. It's always the bias here that you ease in front and back between the notch and the point of the shoulder cap. So what I need to do is get rid of all this somehow. What I very often do is just go ahead and I curve it around my hand like this, because you want to ease in a little bit. You actually can get an extra inch of fabric around there without it showing. So I want to ease in a little bit because the sleeve looks nicer. It rounds that way and it looks a lot better. But when I get up to here where there's just too much and I can't do anything about it, sometimes I take a tuck like this, front and back, and think of which way you're going to tuck it. If you do it this way so that it goes down on the inside, by the time you get to the outside, the tuck will go up. And so I always tuck it the other way so that when it's on the outside, it'll go down. And it looks kind of nice that way sometimes, to just have a little tuck front and back. So that's one alternative that you might try. Another one would be, as I have here on this little cap, this makes a kind of a pretty little thing. And these are pin tucks with twin needles, so that's another possibility. And as you sew with these twin needles, you can't backstitch. It would look terrible. It would show. And so instead what I would do is cut all the threads off shorter after I do it up here at the top. And then down at the bottom, I would have to pull one of these threads. And in pulling it, I would be pulling the outside threads to the inside. And once I get them both done, because of course when you sew with a pin tuck, the twin needle, when you sew that, you have two spools of thread on top, but only the one bobbin underneath. And so you can see that navy thread on the bobbin. It kind of goes back and forth and catches those two top threads. That's what causes the little tuck. Okay, here I've got 3 threads out here, and I would just then tie a knot, and everything works out beautifully. Tie a double knot, and you'd have to do that on every pin tuck because that's the only way it's going to look nice. It will not look nice if you backstitch. So this is another possibility. After this is all pin tucked like this, then you could ease some in here and it would look just fine. If you'd put a little ease between each of those tucks, it wouldn't make any difference and it wouldn't look ugly and it wouldn't look homemade. So another possibility, you can think of other possibilities, but what I decided to do on this jacket is to give it a little dart right at the top. And I just made sure that this dart joins into where the shoulder seam is, so it just kind of blends. Now if you want to, you can even stitch there across and up again so that the stitching line blends with the shoulder seam. So there are a lot of alternatives and any of them are preferable to having little gathers and tucks here and there or little ugly places. Right now you can see what looks like a few dents there. I assure you by the time a rounded arm gets in there won't be any there. Now before we leave this, let's also look at the interfacing. I'm going to eventually go over the machine and sew that dart in the other sleeve. But let's look at what else is here in this jacket. For one thing, interfacing, because this is something that's going to be very important in any jacket you make. I want to have the whole front done. This one has a princess line, and so I have the interfacing in 2 pieces here. I want to certainly have any construction details supported by interfacing, such as this pocket, and I have a couple little welts here above and below the pocket, and then the pocket flap comes out between them. I have bound buttonholes here, which are so easy to make, it's unbelievable, in leather. And by the way, what I do with this, as far as, you know, when you finish a buttonhole, you always have to finish the facing to the back side of it. What I have done here, and it's all ready to cut, I guess, so I'll just show you how. What I would do is just go ahead and cut away the, whoops, wrong drawer. I keep all my paper supplies down here for pattern work, and I keep all my marking and cutting tools up here. But wouldn't you know it, I have my little scissors all over at the machine. Well, anyway, you can see on the other buttonholes what I've done. I've cut away, after I stitched it, I just cut away right close to my stitching line. So this one still has to be cut, and it'll just be cutting away there real carefully so I don't reach through and grab the buttonhole. But it looks very pretty, and it's very easy to do that. But you can see where else I have interfacing. Under the arm, across the top of the back, across the shoulders. I want to have a little bit in the hem. And if this isn't the same interfacing that's used everywhere else, that's quite all right. It isn't going to matter. Now this is kind of a flared jacket, a little bit down at the bottom, because you're going from waist down into a larger hip area. And so it does flare out a little bit. When you fold that up for a hem, notice how there is a little bit of excess there. It really doesn't matter this much. I haven't even done any pressing on it yet, and that will ease in a little bit. But also, when I'm completely finished, the lining is going to come down to here and cover all that, and so it really won't make any difference. Notice, though, how I have this interfacing that is longer than the hem itself, and then when you hem, you do a catch stitch to that interfacing, and it doesn't show on the outside, and it makes your hem look a whole lot nicer if you have that interfacing to pad in between the layers. So that's what it looks like. What also I have here after I set in the sleeve is going to be a shoulder pad, and the kind that I've used here is this one. And the reason I use this, it's a bullnose pad it's usually called. The reason I use that is because it doesn't stop right at the shoulder the way usually set-in sleeve pads do. It goes beyond, and that kind of pads out the dart by having it there. So there are several shapes. Just check through your notions departments in the store and see what would be the best one for whatever your project is. Okay, then when we get over to the machine, we're going to be ready to do a little dart in this, and I've already determined on the other dart, I better take another look and make sure, but I've already determined, yes, you can see here's the dart, and I've slashed it open to make it as flat as possible. And right up at the top of it, it's a 5/8 inch dart, so I'll just take this sleeve out and we'll go over to the machine and do a few more things over there. And any time I have to pin things, well, I use the same pins no matter what, but I really like to look for the really fine pins. Now these are long. You can see that they are, about 1 1/4 inches long, but they're very fine. They're 0.5 millimeters, and sometimes you have to look hard to find those. And they have glass heads, so that if I should press over them, they aren't going to melt like plastic heads would, so they're fine. And before we leave, let me talk about this interfacing that I think I started to say something about perhaps and didn't finish. I like to try, because I never know until I try it on a scrap, I like to try several kinds. I just always store my interfacings here handy at my work table down on the bottom shelf so that I can reach for whatever I need and take a little sample off it. But I have about 4 different kinds here just to try which one felt best and which one worked best, to see which one peels off easily or which one actually stays, to see which one feels best. This one feels a little stiff after it's done, and so this is the one I decided on here. A new one that just came out, I already had that finished before this came out, but I might decide on this one next time. Try them and see what's going to be the best for your particular situation, because you don't know until you try. Well, I'm going to be doing a little stitching here, but before I stitch, I wanted to say something about the vest I'm wearing, because every once in a while I get a letter from you saying, do you really finish all those projects that you start on air? And yes, I really do finish them all sometime or other. Now this, 2 series ago, series 15, I was doing this, and what it is I was using this quilting card. It's automatic stitching. This is the design I was using. All these wonderful templates are in this package, so you can just place them on your garment and make sure it's the right angle to make sure everything comes out just the way you want it to. And so that's what I've done. I've used that same design going around this vest, all around every place. So yes, I actually finish them. Sometimes it takes years, but eventually I'll get back to all of them, or else a sewing friend will talk me out of something I've started, and maybe we'll do some trading. Whichever, they will be used eventually. If you'd like to see what that looks like here, let me go back to the menu. And what it is automatic embroidery, so I'll just push that and the carriage is moving around and it's putting the feed dog down so that it's not in play. And then I have all these different designs from which I can choose, and there are a whole lot more besides. And I still haven't found the one I've used. I'm up to 32 now, or maybe I just passed it by. Yes, I passed it by. Well, I'll go back and see which design it was. It was this one over here is what it is, so I'll just tap that. And there's my design all ready to go. If I had my fabric in that automatic hoop, I could embroider it, but I showed you this once before. So anyway, the vest is finished. Okay, to make that dart, I need it to be about a 5/8 inch, and I know exactly where it's to be because I have a little clip right there at the shoulder point. And so I'm going to turn this sleeve wrong side out so that I can do this. I don't hem a sleeve in advance, because you never know on any given fabric if it needs to be maybe an 1/8 or 1/4 inch longer or shorter, because they might hang differently depending on the fabric. But this one I already knew from the other sleeve that was already in what the length should be, so I went ahead and did this because it's easier to do when it's out of the jacket than when it's in, so you might as well do it if it's handy. Okay, you can see that in this sleeve I also decided to try putting a little extra interfacing in the cap to see if it made it a little nicer. And sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Everything I make, frankly, is an experiment because I like to see what are the alternatives, and is it better this way than the way I've been doing it? Okay, if I want that to be about 5/8 at the top, I'll just go ahead and do that. Now I started to say these small pins I really like because they don't leave any pinholes in here, and that's really good. If you use larger pins, then you have to worry about it making some sort of a permanent mark on it. And I want this about 3.5 inches long. So naturally my measurement is way down there. Here's a measurement, and just see if I have it about that much, from 50 up to, yes, I guessed about right. There's 3.5 inches. Isn't it funny when you sew forever you can guess probably anything within about 6 inches almost on the button. Okay, and then this is going to be a curved dart. It's not going to be a straight lined one because you don't want it to peek out down here. You want it to just curve around there. So you stitch it in that curve if that's what's applicable. Before I do that, I better get back to my menu so that I can get back to ordinary sewing once it gets the feed dog in play. And then I'll push that, and I'm now on straight stitch. But anytime you work with suedes and leathers, you also need to have a slightly larger stitch, so I'll put it up a little bit. And I'm using a small needle. I don't want anything bigger than a number, 75, 80. 80 is good is what I have in right now. That's a number, no, 75 is what I have in right now, a little bit smaller, because there again, you don't want to leave needle holes in. Now there are leather needles, but this is man-made leather, and I don't want to use a leather needle in this because what it does is permanently cut a little slit every time the needle goes in, and I don't want that to happen because should I change my mind about this, I would like to be able to rip out these stitches and not even know they were there because they won't show. Well, that happens if you use a small enough needle. They won't show. And also, there's no reason to put those stitches too close together. And usually you just stitch off the end and maybe tie a knot. But if you're very careful, you can back stitch on this without making, a big fat point of the dart. So that'll work out just fine. And then I'm going to press this. And you need some pressing aids for this, of course. And before I press this, I want to slash this open. I wouldn't do this if I had a Ravelry fabric. I wouldn't do it if I had no lining, but I'm going to, well, you have to line it when you have all this interfacing in because interfacing isn't meant to be pretty. It's meant to be functional. And since it just has utilitarian purposes, I don't want it to show. So I'm going to slash this open as far as I possibly can, and then it'll open when I press it, and it'll be flatter. There'll be less bulk there, and it'll look nicer. Well, for this, you definitely need some pressing aids. Now, where I store all these things, I've got a point presser and a seam roll and a ham. Where I store them all is, I designed that work table. I'm not sure if I told you that or not, but I just put all the features that I need in my workspace is what I put in it. And so on one side of the table, I designed a drawer that was deep enough that I could get all these pressing aids in. And then the shallow drawers are on the other side that I have all my cutting and marking tools in. So I took a ham out of the drawer because you're going to need a curved surface if you are pressing a curve. And so here is that curve. Now, anytime you do some pressing after you've stitched a seam, you always want to, first of all, get that line pressed, and I want to flatten this dart out anyway, because even though I am opening it up, down at the point of it where I couldn't slash it, down there I need to have it as flat as possible to get rid of the bulk. And since I have interfacing in here, I didn't use a press cloth. Ordinarily I would use a press cloth, and what it is always, you can buy them in the shops, or you can just use any thin fabric if you want to, a cotton fabric. What I have used here, this is a commercial one, this is a purchased one, and I'm just going to find a place on this ham now where this little place fits, this curved dart fits, and then I'll be able to do some pressing on it. Right here is where it seems to fit very nicely. I might even put the ham in the sleeve so that I can get it in place here more easily. And you can also make a ham, but these are relatively inexpensive, and I think it's just as easy to buy that ham as it is to make one, because it does provide nice curved surfaces. And also, did you notice how the top side of it was wool? Well, that provides a little texture so that it does a good job of not mashing anything down too flat. And so it's just moving this along over the press cloth, and then after I've pressed it, and this isn't done sufficiently, I'll do it better after I'm finished. After a while I'll do it better. But while it's still all hot and steamy, I kind of like to do this with my finger and thumb so that I can get it mashed down as nicely as possible. Then if you want it flatter still, you can always stitch around it, but that does a pretty good job. Where else I'm going to do some pressing is when I do the collar. I had a pointed collar on that jacket, and it would be similar to this. There's just a point stitch there. And what I like for that, as far as pressing aids go, is a point presser. And it comes like this, just wood, nothing else on it. I kind of like to put a little padding on it, just like an ironing board has some padding. So what I have here is nothing sophisticated. It is simply a piece of wool fabric, scrap left over from something. I have a pin down here at the end so that it just fits over the edge of that point presser nicely. And what I'm going to do, because again I like a little texture and I like just a little bit of padding against the right side of the fabric, what I'm going to do with this now that I've stitched it, and when I stitched it, it was bigger stitches until I get down to the point, and then just push the buttons and get down to smaller stitches to go around the corner. And usually right at the corner you go across a little tiny stitch or two so that it will turn to a nice point. And then when you put it over the point presser, you're going to press it. On this side, I'll just press this one open, and of course now the leather itself, the leather surface will be open, so you definitely need a press cloth for this. Or an alternative might be to put a Teflon plate, the kind that clip on your irons, one of those protective ones, but I usually use a press cloth in addition because I really want to protect that leather. And you'd press that, and I'm not going to do a good job for time reasons. And after you get that all pressed, then you turn it the other way and press the other corner too. And once you have that pressed open, then you do some grading there. Now what grading is that's cutting one seam short and the other one longer, because if you just trim them off both the same, there's going to be a little ridge around the edge that you don't want. So I'm always going to trim the under one, the under collar, the one closer to your body is what you always trim a little bit shorter like this, about 1/8 of an inch on this. It's non-ravelly fabric, and even if it did ravel somewhat, I have this fusible interfacing on it that holds it in place, and so it's really glued together. It's not going to. And then the other seam allowance I'll cut a little bit larger, And so that when they're all turned right side out and it's pressed again, they will fall in different places. All the seams are staggered, so it really does a nice professional job. And it's already pressed open, or it would be if I had done that thoroughly. And then you press it closed. And when you press it closed, it's good to use a point presser to get the corner out. And then when you press it closed, just roll a little tiny bit toward the under collar so that you don't see that edge around the outside. And it does a really fine job. Now, what do you do when you have a rounded collar instead of a squared one? Well, we've run out of time, so I'm going to have to show you next time what you do for this, because certainly you can't put this over that point presser to press it open, so we're just going to have to deal with that another time. Also, we're going to have belts, and we're going to have to do some other things, so that'll also be in the next program. And a few other surprises. We'll do a few little decorative things. Well, now we've made a few nitty-gritty decisions, and those aren't the fun problems to solve. So let's move on then to the fun part, to embellishing. And next time, we're going to just paint the town red.